Welcome to the boring history for sleep. Tonight, we drift back through time to a battlefield not filled with only cannons and cavalry, but one where the scent of gunpowder mixed with the quiet rustle of a well-worn page. This is the very soothing, very bookish story of why Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Europe and wearer of funny hats, insisted on bringing a personal librarian to war. So, find a soft place to rest, let your mind wander, and we'll let the past do the rest. Campfire, pages, and cannon smoke, where we begin our journey beside a battlefield and a bookshelf on wheels. Let's set the scene together. It's the late 1790s. Somewhere between Italy and Austria, the sky is the color of tin, and the grass has long since given up trying to grow. A ragged French camp stretches over the muddy earth, tents pitched like crumpled napkins, horses stamping and steaming in the early morning fog. A soldier yawns by a flickering campfire, his uniform dusted with the previous day's cannon smoke. Men cough, stretch, sharpen things, the usual business of war. But just a little further off, behind a worn wagon with a busted wheel, something curious is happening. A man in spectacles is gently brushing mud off the corner of a book. He's not a soldier. His name isn't remembered by most history books. But in Napoleon Bonaparte's army, he had a vital task. He was a guardian of knowledge, a battlefield librarian, and quite possibly the only person in Europe to bring Montaigne to a musket fight. He flips open the cover. The pages flutter in the wind like drowsy moths. The ink is smudged in places, the spine patched with leather that may or may not have once been a glove. But here it is, a volume of Plutarch's lives ready to do its duty, not to wound or to conquer, but to comfort. You see, where other generals travelled with barrels of rum and crates of ammunition, Napoleon Bonaparte brought books, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, in trunks, crates, satchels, waterproofed, labelled, catalogued, each one carefully selected for its ability to inspire, to educate, or simply to pass the time when your tent was leaking and your boots were wet. Because in the middle of a war, Napoleon believed in something very peculiar for a conqueror: the power of reading. Now, to be fair, he wasn't hauling libraries for the good of the troops. This wasn't an army-wide literacy campaign. Most soldiers barely had the time or energy to care about books between foraging and avoiding bayonets. No, the library was primarily for one reader, the general himself. A 5'6", give or take, deeply driven, somewhat vain, often sleepless man who would rather read Tacitus by candlelight than sit around playing cards. And that's what made it so strange and oddly beautiful. Because while other leaders might end their evenings with a stiff drink or a mistress or a game of dice, Napoleon would unfurl a map, then reach for a book. Perhaps the Iliad, to compare his military exploits to those of Achilles, or a treatise by Rousseau to ponder how people should be governed before governing them by force, or even a sentimental romance to remind himself between battles that he had a heart. This small ritual, this act of reading in the stillness after smoke and shouting, became part of his command style. Imagine it with me. It's night. The fire crackles, casting shadows on a tent made of worn canvas. Rain taps lightly on the roof. Outside, the wounded murmur in their sleep. A horse nickers in the distance. Inside, by the dim glow of a lamp, Napoleon sits, boots still muddy, his bicorn hat resting on a barrel. He turns a page slowly, the silence so deep you can almost hear the paper breathe. Outside, a sergeant curses as he trips over a root. Inside, Livy's History of Rome whispers of ancient glories. And beside the general's cot, stacked like precious relics, is a collection of books that had journeyed farther than most people ever would. Of course, it wasn't easy keeping books alive in a war zone. They had to be packed securely, often in specially designed cases. Each trunk was a minor engineering miracle, lined with fabric, sometimes compartmentalized, always heavy. Some were built like small dressers. Others resembled toolboxes, filled not with hammers or nails but with enlightenment. One soldier later recalled that it took nearly as much care to transport Napoleon's books as it did his cannons. And heaven help the man who dropped one in a puddle. Still, there was something deeply human about the whole affair, because let's face it, bringing books to war is kind of absurd. There were no quiet cafes or plush chairs, no bookmarks or warm beverages, just wind, smoke, and the endless movement of armies. But there, amid it all, were books, crumpled, smudged, dog-eared, yet alive, and not just histories or philosophies. Some were plays, poetry, scientific manuals, even a cookbook or two for when Napoleon got nostalgic for Corsican stew. This wasn't about escapism, it was about continuity, about anchoring the mind in something stable, something eternal, while the world burned around it. Now perhaps you're wondering, why does this matter? Why should we care that one small, overly ambitious Frenchman dragged a library across Europe? Well, because it's oddly comforting. It's a reminder that even in the most chaotic times, people still seek quiet. That even warlords, especially warlords, need bedtime stories. And that books, even soggy ones, are small acts of rebellion against madness. In the end, the campfires went out. The cannons cooled. Empires rose and fell. But some of those books, they survived. A few sit today in glass cases, their bindings worn, their pages gently yellowed. And if you lean in closely, you might still catch the faintest whiff of wood smoke and gunpowder. Or maybe that's just old leather and imagination. Either way, they whisper stories of emperors, of battles, and of a quiet night long ago when someone just needed a good book. And now, we drift onward. The fire has burned low. The librarian closes the book. The soldiers sleep, or try to. And the man at the center of it all turns another page, not knowing where tomorrow's march will take him, but knowing at least he won't be going without a library. Little Emperor, Big Reader, where we open the flap of Napoleon's tent and peek inside his bedside bookshelf. There's something quietly amusing about imagining a man who could command half of Europe, gently turning pages under a wool blanket. But that's exactly the scene we're stepping into tonight. Let's slip back into that canvas tent. The wind is slower now, the stars blurred behind a thin veil of fog. Horses shuffle in their sleep. A tin cup rattles against a post. And there, by the flicker of oil light, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Eyes slightly puffy from lack of sleep. Uniform half off, boots still on. One hand resting on a map of Bavaria, the other carefully holding a copy of Plutarch's Lives. Yes, this was the same man who ordered daring river crossings, who restructured legal codes, and once wrote 6 letters to his wife in a single day while fighting the Austrians. But now he's not strategizing, not giving orders, not scowling at diplomats. He's reading, and reading deeply. You might be surprised. After all, Napoleon doesn't strike us as a cozy reader kind of figure. He's remembered as a conqueror, not a bookworm. And yet, books were his comfort, his teachers, sometimes even his friends. As a child on the island of Corsica, long before the hat and the battles, Napoleon was a lonely little boy with a thick Corsican accent and a chip on his shoulder the size of a small kingdom. He was sent to military school in France, where his classmates teased him endlessly. He was short, he was quiet, he ate weird food, and when they laughed, he read everything: history, mathematics, philosophy, tragedy, satire, natural sciences. If it had pages, young Napoleon would absorb it. And he wasn't a casual reader either. He read aggressively. devoured books the way some people devour revenge plots. He once wrote to his brother, "The strong mind is the mind that can read deeply and judge fairly." And for him, reading wasn't just entertainment, it was training to rule. Now let's fast forward. Imagine him again, now a rising general, aged 27, commanding thousands of men. And what does he do in the evenings after long marches? He reads Rousseau's Confessions while wrapped in a wool cloak, occasionally dipping dry bread in wine. And he wasn't content to just read for pleasure. No. Napoleon took notes. He argued with the margins, underlined entire paragraphs, scribbled rebuttals in the back pages. He studied Voltaire not just for ideas, but for style. He analyzed Tacitus to learn how emperors fell. He admired Montaigne for his introspection, and also for being French enough to quote in casual conversation. Sometimes he read books just to prove he was smarter than their authors. But he also had a softer side, especially in his reading tastes. He adored The Sorrows of Young Werther, a romantic novel about unrequited love and emotional collapse. The kind of book you'd expect from a brooding teenager, not a battlefield tactician. And yet, Napoleon read it repeatedly. In fact, during the Egyptian campaign, he was known to carry Werther with him, and once gave a copy as a gift to a fellow officer who had just broken up with his fiancée. Say what you want about the man, he understood heartbreak. He even wrote love letters with the same flourish he brought to military orders. To Josephine, his famously passionate and famously complicated wife, he once wrote, "I send you 3 kisses, 1 on your heart, 1 on your mouth, and 1 on your soul." Then promptly asked for updated troop numbers in the same letter. Books weren't just leisure. They were his compass. When he was lost, he read. When he was victorious, he read. And when he was exiled, well, he read even more. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in his peak years, during the great campaigns of Italy and Austria, Napoleon was known to issue reading lists to his aides. He'd ask, "Have you read Livy?" "No, you'll never understand Rome if you haven't." He believed that the truly powerful man was the one who understood ideas, because ideas could outlive empires. And so, amid the drums and dust of marching armies, his tent always had a little corner where books lived. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being an assistant in Napoleon's camp. Your job is to carry messages, arrange travel, and keep track of which copy of the Iliad has Napoleon's annotations in it. You approach his tent at dusk, you knock. A tired voice calls out, "Bring me Rousseau, but not the one from Toulon." The Geneva edition. You sigh, of course, because the emperor didn't just read books, he had opinions about editions. Some editions were too interpretive, others had lazy footnotes. Once, he even criticized a translation of Thucydides for having poor paragraph structure. Napoleon read with purpose. He read with precision. And heaven help the poor soul who tried to argue philosophy with him over dinner. Now, while this all might sound endearing, it had very real consequences. Napoleon's reading shaped his leadership style. He borrowed ideas shamelessly from history, used anecdotes from Caesar's Gallic Wars as models for his dispatches, quoted Marcus Aurelius in memos, and cited the social contract right before ignoring it. He knew that books could lend legitimacy, that citing an ancient philosopher could soften the image of a general marching into your city. After all, it's harder to resent someone quoting Seneca while occupying your capital. Slightly harder, at least. But more than anything, reading grounded him. Napoleon moved fast. He thought fast. He fought fast. But reading forced him to slow down, to reflect, to feel. And for a man who often outran his own conscience, that was necessary. In the stillness of night, when the world outside his tent was full of strategy and fear and frost, his books waited patiently. like old friends. It's easy now to mock him, to picture the little general sitting on a pile of cushions, reading romantic poetry while France burned. But the truth is more complicated and more tender. Napoleon read because he was human, because power is lonely, because the page listens when people won't. And maybe, just maybe, because deep down, he wanted to be remembered not just as a man who conquered, but as a man who thought. In a war-torn tent beneath a sky full of stars, one man sat curled beside his books, dreaming not just of empire, but of words. The librarian who rode on mules, where we meet the man tasked with hauling a library through chaos and keeping the pages dry. Let's be honest, when you imagine a Napoleonic army, the last thing that probably comes to mind is a softly spoken man balancing philosophy books on a donkey. But history, as always, has its surprises. Tonight, let's wander a little off the battlefield, past the gunpowder carts and the sleeping infantry, past the surgeon's tent, the cooking fires, the endless clatter of metal and worry. There, behind a weary mule, walks a man wearing a waistcoat, squinting at a manifest. In one hand, he holds a small ledger. In the other, a copy of Voltaire wrapped in oiled cloth. He's not here to fight. He's here to preserve knowledge and make sure Cicero doesn't fall into a river. His name? That's a bit fuzzy. Some say it was Louis-Antoine Fauvelet de Bourrienne, Napoleon's childhood friend and longtime secretary. Others claim the librarian role shifted between several aides and scholars. What's clear is this: Napoleon's army didn't just carry muskets and flags. It carried a man whose entire job was to organize, pack, and deliver books. And yes, he rode on mules. Let's pause there. It's worth appreciating the absurdity of it all. Imagine the scene. Cannons roll through the Alps. Men shout orders in 5 different dialects. Someone is playing a tin whistle very badly. And there, trudging through the muck, is a mule loaded not with powder or rations, but with Herodotus. It wasn't glamorous work. Books are heavy, books are fragile. Books, unlike swords, don't handle rain very well. So the battlefield librarian had to be creative. Volumes were wrapped in oilskins, tucked inside double-lined crates. Sometimes they were hidden beneath false lids, just in case enemy troops had a sudden thirst for Enlightenment philosophy. And of course, he had to keep an inventory, a detailed list where each book had traveled, which were in good condition, which had succumbed to weather or war. There's a rumor, never quite proven, that one copy of the Republic was so badly damaged in the Egyptian heat that it fused together entirely. Napoleon was reportedly devastated, not because it couldn't be read, but because it was the good edition. Now, life as Napoleon's librarian wasn't exactly safe. You weren't immune from the dangers of campaign life just because your weapon of choice was a feathered quill. You still had to sleep in tents, endure storms, cross rivers, avoid being trampled by horses or captured by Prussians, and if the emperor requested a specific book at midnight, you got it. No excuses, no delays. Even if it meant wandering 3 miles back through muddy hills to find Tacitus, because the emperor couldn't sleep without reading about ancient Roman corruption. The job required stamina and patience and very, very strong mules. Some reports suggest that the traveling library was often carried in special wagons built just for books. Not fancy ones, this wasn't Versailles, but sturdy, weatherproofed boxes on wheels. Each box was arranged by theme: history, politics, science, military theory, romance novels. Napoleon wouldn't admit to reading, and each had little compartments, slots where books could be pulled easily, even while on the move. The librarian had to memorize it all. He needed to know at any moment where a specific copy of Julius Caesar's commentaries was located, even if it was wedged between a topographical atlas and a French translation of Plato. Because when the emperor wanted a book, he really wanted that book. And it wasn't just a matter of having them. The books had to be preserved, presented, cared for, which meant cleaning. Yes. Books in a battlefield library had to be dusted, aired out, and sometimes dried by the fire after heavy rain. There's something almost heartbreakingly tender about that image. A weary librarian crouched by the fire, gently pressing pages apart with a clean cloth, trying to save a soggy Montaigne from turning into a paper pancake. Meanwhile, a few feet away, a soldier sharpens his bayonet, two forms of survival, side by side. Despite the challenges, this humble role held immense value. The librarian was one of the few in the army who had direct, frequent contact with Napoleon himself. He knew the general's reading moods, he knew when to offer the Iliad, when to suggest Rousseau, and when to quietly remove Voltaire from the tent before it sparked a political rant. He was, in a way, Napoleon's intellectual concierge, and it wasn't all theory and strategy. Sometimes the emperor just wanted to read about gardening. He once requested a treatise on agriculture during the Italian campaign, not because he planned to start a vineyard mid-battle, but because he found the diagrams relaxing. The librarian, ever dutiful, located the book and delivered it by mule. Now, not everyone appreciated the librarian's role. There were officers who scoffed, soldiers who laughed, enemies who simply didn't believe that such a thing existed. But the librarian didn't care. He had work to do and a deadline, usually a very literal one. Napoleon often demanded a book before breakfast, which meant the librarian had to start planning before dawn. Sometimes he even had to smuggle books. During politically sensitive campaigns like in Spain or Egypt, certain volumes were considered controversial, too radical, too French, too filled with ideas, and so the librarian learned how to conceal them, hidden under maps, wrapped in supply manifests, sometimes disguised as Bibles, all to make sure the emperor could still get his evening reading without causing an international incident. We don't know everything about this unsung hero of the empire. His letters, if he wrote them, are mostly lost. His name, in many records, is replaced with phrases like book steward or literary aid. But his presence mattered because he wasn't just hauling paper, he was hauling legacy. Every time he packed a volume of Livy or a copy of The Rights of Man, he was ensuring that the emperor's mind remained fed, even while his armies fed on conquest. And while bullets flew and boots marched, he was thinking about page numbers, which is quietly beautiful. Books on a battlefield, really? Where we gently ask the question, why would a warlord carry a library into combat? It's a fair question. Why bring books to war? Why, in the middle of mud, blood, and military logistics, would a man like Napoleon Bonaparte take time to pack his Plutarch, his Voltaire, and his tragic, romantic fiction? The whole idea sounds slightly absurd, like showing up to a sword fight with a thesaurus. And yet time and again, Napoleon did exactly that. He insisted on it. At every major campaign, Italy, Egypt, Prussia, even the disastrous march into Russia, Napoleon's library came with him. Always, you'd think someone would have stopped him. Sir, maybe we don't need a 3-volume history of Carthage today. Perhaps we prioritize bandages. But no, because to Napoleon, books were not luxuries, they were necessities, as essential as maps, messengers, or morning coffee. In fact, he once described books as the nourishment of the mind, and he was serious about it. He told his staff, "A man must feed his intellect as he feeds his body." Of course, this was the same man who forgot to eat dinner half the time because he was too absorbed in a volume of Livy, so perhaps the metaphor got a bit tangled. But the sentiment was clear. To Napoleon, reading wasn't a side hobby, it was strategy. Let's take a moment to really think about it. Picture a battlefield. Not a movie version with dramatic music and slow motion, but the real thing. Cold, noisy, chaotic. Men shouting orders, horses screaming, cannonballs casually rearranging the landscape. Now, somewhere nearby is in a tent that smells faintly of gun oil and damp wool. Napoleon is flipping through a copy of Polybius, not because he's bored, but because he wants insight, understanding, wisdom. He's trying to remember how Hannibal crossed the Alps, how Caesar quelled uprisings, how Alexander turned rivers into roads. Because for all his brilliance, Napoleon knew he wasn't the first man to lead an army, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. So he studied. And in doing so, he treated war not just as brute force, but as a thinking man's game. In one of his more introspective letters, Napoleon wrote, "The art of war is great and noble, but the greatest art is to read it from those who lived it first." It's a strangely humble thought coming from a man so famously confident. But therein lies the odd paradox. Napoleon believed in destiny. He believed in greatness. He also believed that greatness had to be informed, shaped by history, philosophy, and moral imagination, which meant that even on the battlefield, the real action sometimes took place on the page. Of course, not everyone understood this. His generals occasionally rolled their eyes. One aide reportedly muttered, "He fights battles with one hand and reads with the other." But Napoleon didn't care, because when he read, especially in those rare, quiet moments between campaigns, he wasn't escaping reality. He was engaging with it more deeply. Books helped him make sense of things. And let's be honest, war rarely makes sense. It's confusing, exhausting, filled with things that go boom when you least expect it. But books are orderly. They start at the beginning. They go somewhere. They explain things. And for someone who had to make dozens of impossible decisions every day, books offered something rare and precious: context. Napoleon didn't just read histories. He read political theory, economics, poetry, novels, science. One night he might be studying Machiavelli. The next, he might be lost in the botanical musings of Lamarck. He reportedly once spent an evening arguing with himself, out loud, about the finer points of Rousseau's social contract, while his staff quietly pretended not to hear. Reading gave him perspective, and perspective gave him power. Because when you understand how people think, how they've struggled, how they've built and failed and loved across centuries, you lead differently, or at least you try to. Now, there's another reason Napoleon read on the battlefield, and it's a little softer, a little more human. He read because he was lonely. Power, as it turns out, is incredibly isolating. When everyone around you either fears you or flatters you, it's hard to know who you are. But books don't lie, books don't pander, they just offer themselves. A quiet conversation between you and someone who lived long ago, who maybe also had trouble sleeping or feared being forgotten. Books reminded Napoleon that he wasn't the first to struggle, that others had also tried to rule well and failed, and tried again. He once said, "In reading, I meet men who are not afraid to speak the truth to me." And for a man whose empire was built on whispers and propaganda, that mattered. There's even something sweetly comic about his battlefield reading habits. Imagine being a courier, breathless and muddy, delivering urgent news of troop movements, only to find the emperor nose deep in a philosophical dialogue by Seneca. You wait. He waves you off. 5 more minutes, he says, without looking up. Eventually, he responds to the emergency, but only after finishing the paragraph. It happened frequently. His men got used to it. They learned that the emperor is reading was a legitimate excuse for delay, and in some strange way it was comforting. Because if Napoleon could make time for reading in the middle of a war, Maybe there was hope for civilization after all. Now, of course, there were practical uses too. Napoleon studied military history obsessively. He dissected tactics, terrain, morale. He read reports, wrote annotations, even criticized long-dead generals for their poor formation choices. At one point, he told his librarian to assemble a reading list of every major military campaign in recorded history. Not because he was trying to copy them, but because he wanted to improve them, and he often did. His strategies were a strange blend of classical logic and audacious improvisation, born partly from experience and partly from centuries of books whispering advice. But more than anything, books helped him think. Napoleon was, at his core, a thinker, not a philosopher, not quite a scholar, but a restless mind in constant motion. He saw patterns in politics, echoes of ancient conflicts in modern ones. He understood that history didn't just repeat, it rhymed, and the more he read, the more he believed that winning a battle wasn't just about having the bigger army, it was about having the bigger idea. So yes, books on a battlefield. It seems silly, but it wasn't. It was an anchor, a weapon, a mirror, a pillow. It was comfort in chaos. It was firelight on parchment. It was a man, wrapped in a military cloak, turning a page, while the wind howled outside his tent. So as you drift off tonight, remember, even in the noise of war, there are quiet pages turning. Even in the chaos of command, a man may still pause to read a poem. And even the fiercest minds sometimes just want to finish the chapter. The tiny traveling library, where we open the drawers of Napoleon's battlefield bookshelf and admire the finest reading trunk in Europe. We've talked about books on the battlefield and the man who carried them. But tonight, we get to peek inside the thing itself. Napoleon's library on the go, not a dusty room with rolling ladders and Latin inscriptions, not a cathedral of knowledge with echoing halls and grumpy archivists. This was something smaller, quieter, much more adorable. A box. A very sturdy, very French, very serious-looking box. But when you opened it, books, glorious books, neatly arranged, lovingly categorized, sometimes alphabetized, sometimes grouped by theme, all tucked into compartments like precious relics in a reliquary. It was less a trunk and more a portable altar to the written word. And somehow it survived battlefields, border-crossing storms, mutinies, and at least one donkey-related incident. Let's explore it together. Imagine the box. Roughly the size of a large suitcase, dark leather, reinforced corners, brass hinges polished to a gentle gleam. When you opened it, it didn't just swing open like a normal trunk, it unfolded, drawer by drawer, layer by layer, like a magician's prop, if the magician were a sleep-deprived general obsessed with Cicero. Inside, rows of books nestled against one another, each one selected with care, based not just on subject but on weight, because weight mattered. If it was too heavy, the mule would suffer, too light, and it wasn't worth the space. Every book had to earn its keep. Napoleon once commissioned an official version of this traveling library from a Parisian bookbinder named Monsieur Tuillier. Tuillier designed it like a piece of military equipment, compact, efficient, beautiful. It had 3 levels. The top lifted to reveal maps and papers. The middle had space for 40 to 60 books, depending on thickness. The bottom drawer was for personal items, quills, ink, and perhaps a small flask of brandy for emergencies. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of organization, the 19th century Kindle, except this Kindle needed wheels and several strong assistants. Now let's talk about what was inside. Napoleon's taste in books was wide, sometimes painfully wide. The Iliad and the Odyssey were always included. Plutarch's Lives, essential reading for any man trying to become a living legend. The Social Contract by Rousseau for political daydreams. The Bible, both for inspiration and occasional quote-based debates with priests. Histories of Alexander, Caesar, and Charlemagne. Military theory from the ancients to the Enlightenment. And then, sprinkled in among the epics and manifestos, a few surprises. A sentimental novel about doomed lovers on a tropical island. A treatise on agricultural techniques in southern France. A collection of witty Parisian essays about shoes. Why? Because even emperors need variety, and because boredom, like mud, comes easily on campaign. Napoleon was known to reread his favorite books multiple times. He annotated them, sometimes with neat underlines, sometimes with full-blown rants in the margins. One copy of Livy includes a furious note about Roman senators being unfit for command and filled with laziness, like certain officers I know. Subtle, he was not. But the traveling library wasn't just for idle reading, it was a tool, a reference kit. Before battles, Napoleon often consulted historical accounts of similar confrontations. How did Hannibal cross the Rhone? What flanking maneuvers did Frederick the Great use at Leuthen? He wasn't just reading for knowledge, he was reading for ammunition, the mental kind. The traveling library, in that sense, was a weapon, made of thoughts instead of gunpowder. Now picture the ritual of its unpacking. The tent is set up, the emperor arrives, the maps are laid out, the candles are lit, and then comes the box. Two aides carry it in, one on each side. They set it gently on a stool. Napoleon opens it himself, slowly, carefully. The first book he pulls out is Plutarch. He thumbs the pages, nods once, then moves on to a worn copy of Virgil. By morning, he will have read 3 chapters and marked 2 pages to revisit. Somewhere in a corner, the librarian watches nervously. Because if the emperor finds a misplaced volume, there will be strongly worded remarks. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Books went missing, spines cracked, covers tore. Once, during the Egyptian campaign, a shipment of new volumes was mistaken for firewood. The cook made soup over a burning history of the Peloponnesian War. Napoleon was not amused. He reportedly spent the next evening lecturing the staff on why Thucydides was not kindling. Still, the library persisted. It followed him across Europe, through the Alps, across the Danube, into the endless snow of Russia, where ink froze in its bottles and pages became brittle with frost. There's a story, half legend, half truth, of a volume of Seneca being rescued from a snowbank, dried by a fire, and read aloud in a voice hoarse from frostbite. And in that moment, the cold didn't matter, because the words were still warm. What's most charming, perhaps, is how personal the traveling library became. It wasn't just a collection of books, it was a reflection of Napoleon's mind, a portable mirror of his ambitions, fears, tastes, and contradictions. One drawer might contain the moral philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, the next, a guide to making cherry preserves. He wanted to be remembered as a man of action and intellect, a general who carried wisdom with his weapons. And in the quiet moments between wars, when the cannons were silent and the tents flickered gently in the wind, he could retreat into that box, turn the key, open the lid, and for a few minutes return not to the battlefield, but to the library. Picture that box, sitting patiently in the corner of a tent, waiting to be opened. Inside, dusty pages hum with stories, wisdom, strategy, humor, hope. And somewhere across time, a small man with a large hat leans over it and reads, because even emperors need a bedtime book, between cannons and candles, where the battlefield fades and the light of a single page flickers against the night. There is a special kind of silence that settles over a military camp after a day of marching. Not peace, not exactly rest, but a hush. The cannons are quiet for now. The men have eaten what counts for food. Boots are off, or at least loosened. The wounded sleep in makeshift tents, groaning softly in their dreams. The horses shift and breathe in long, rhythmic bursts, and somewhere near the heart of it all, inside a rectangular tent with heavy flaps and a half-finished map of Prussia tacked to the side, Napoleon Bonaparte reads, just him, a book and a candle. Let's drift into the tent with him, quietly. The lamp is low, flickering slightly. The air smells of wax and wool and the faintest trace of gunpowder. On one side of the room, a map table is covered in quills, ink pots and biscuit crumbs. On the other, his cot, unmade. A jacket draped over one corner like a forgotten thought. And in the center, seated in a plain campaign chair, legs crossed at the ankle, the Emperor of the French is hunched over a book, reading. The sounds of war are still out there, somewhere. But right now, all he hears is the whisper of a turning page, the soft scratch of pen against margin, a murmur from the wind and the stories, the voices of long-dead philosophers and poets and generals gathering around him like old friends. He reads, slowly, methodically, mouth twitching sometimes when a passage strikes him as clever or foolish, or both. He tilts the book, lets the candlelight fall across a highlighted phrase, nods to himself, not a nod of agreement, a nod of recognition, as if to say, yes. Yes, I see what you mean, Seneca. I've thought that too. This is not a moment of luxury, it's a ritual, a habit, a tether. The battlefield is full of noise and movement and decisions, but the tent, the book, the candle, stillness. Napoleon, for all his speed and fire and ambition, needed that stillness. He needed something that didn't require orders, didn't require allegiance, didn't rise and fall like governments or fortunes. Books didn't betray him. Books didn't flatter him. Books just offered themselves. He once said, "My greatest moments of clarity come in the company of a quiet page," which is quite a thing to admit when your job is shouting orders at thousands of men. There's a myth that powerful men don't crave gentleness, that the great only hunger for conquest. But Napoleon? He was a conqueror who read poetry aloud in a whisper, alone. He would trace his finger along the margins of the Iliad, reading Achilles' grief like it was written for him. He once paused mid-chapter to scribble a note to Josephine, his famously stormy love, writing, "There are verses in this book that hurt me because they remind me of your absence." Then, in the same breath, he ordered 2 new cannons to be brought to the river crossing. Duality, thy name is Bonaparte. Now imagine the interruptions. A courier bursts in, muddy, breathless, panicked. "Sire, urgent news from the Austrian front." Napoleon lifts a hand, eyes still on the page. One more line, just one. He finishes the sentence, closes the book, marks his place with a pencil stub. Only then does he turn to the courier. "Yes, speak." And in that small gesture, waiting until the sentence is finished, you see the man who believed that knowledge mattered, even under pressure, especially under pressure, because decisions made without reflection, that's how empires fall. And the soldiers knew, they whispered about it, that their general, their tiny volcano of a leader, would spend hours poring over Plutarch before a major assault, that he read about Caesar crossing the Rubicon just days before he crossed the Alps, that he quoted Marcus Aurelius at breakfast while still tying his boots. They found it strange, but also strangely reassuring. If the man leading them into battle read books by candlelight, maybe there was a plan, maybe they weren't just charging into chaos, maybe history itself was the playbook. He even traveled with backup candles, and when candles weren't available, he read by moonlight, or waited. There's a famous story, One night, his lamp was broken during a storm. The library cart had not yet arrived. Napoleon, already stripped down to his shirt sleeves, stood outside in the rain holding a soggy book, fuming. No one dared approach him, until a junior officer, very nervously, offered him a spare lantern and dry copy of The Life of Cato. Napoleon took it wordlessly and read until the rain stopped. Of course, not every book soothed him. He often argued with them. He once threw a copy of Rousseau's Emile across the tent after declaring that the author understood nothing about actual children. Then he retrieved the book, smoothed the pages, and finished it anyway. Reading for Napoleon wasn't always gentle, but it was necessary. It reminded him he was human, that even emperors are students, that no matter how many lands you march across, there is always one more chapter to turn. So tonight, if you're drifting in your own bed, unsure where your thoughts will take you next, picture him there, the tent, the chair, the candle, slowly flickering lower. Outside, the world is loud, but in this quiet corner of time, a small man turns a page and finds, if only for a moment, peace. Stories as strategy, where we discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is a biography. By now, you know that Napoleon read a lot. But he didn't just read to pass the time. He read to win, to conquer minds before he conquered cities, to anticipate battles before they were fought, to enter the heads of generals long dead and emerge with the answers he needed. Because for Napoleon Bonaparte, books weren't just companions. They were strategic tools. They were maps made of memory, tactics etched in ink, and every story he read became another arrow in his quiver. Let's go back to a chilly night in Italy. The troops are camped on a damp hillside. The Austrians are lurking in the next valley, somewhere behind a screen of fog and fir trees. The officers gather, anxious. The plan is unclear. But in his tent, Napoleon is calm. He's reading the life of Hannibal, tracing the arc of another short, brilliant general who also liked elephants and complicated flanking maneuvers. He notes how Hannibal crossed the Alps, how he used terrain as a weapon, how he divided his enemy's attention just before the killing blow. And then, click, a new idea. He slams the book shut and calls his aides. "We'll cross at dawn," he says, "where they won't expect it. I want a false signal here, and the real movement there." The staff nod, scramble, run. And somewhere, in a crate by the cot, Hannibal's story quietly returns to its shelf, having just helped shape the outcome of a 19th century battle. Napoleon once wrote, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon," which is a delightfully cynical thing to say. But underneath that cynicism is something more revealing. He didn't just read history, he used it. He studied biographies the way a locksmith studies locks. Not because they were beautiful, but because they held secrets, patterns, mistakes, lessons. He looked for how people thought, not just what they did. He wanted to know, what did Alexander do when his troops grew restless? How did Caesar win loyalty from the masses and the Senate? Why did Frederick the Great lose Silesia, and how did he get it back? These weren't abstract questions, they were blueprints, and Napoleon was a man who loved building new empires from old instructions. It's easy to imagine him, feet propped on a traveling trunk, reading a passage from Julius Caesar's commentaries aloud, pausing every few lines to mutter, efficient, brutal, noted, then returning to his own plans, now slightly improved by 2,000 years of borrowed wisdom. He once claimed that Plutarch's lives taught him more about statecraft than any contemporary political treatise. And if you've ever read Plutarch, you'll know that it's basically a collection of long, elegant gossip about ancient men and their tragic decisions. But Napoleon read between the lines. He saw personality, power dynamics, the quiet signals behind public gestures. He learned from them, and then he imitated them. He would sometimes cite these stories in conversation, not to show off, but to frame situations. If an officer complained about troop morale, he'd bring up the harsh winter of Caesar's German campaign. If someone doubted the value of boldness, he'd quote Alexander charging into Persia at just 22 years old. He wielded stories like a fencer wields a blade, swiftly, precisely, and always to gain ground. And when he needed to persuade others, he didn't just issue orders, he told a story. He might say, "Do you remember what Scipio did after the fire at Cartagena?" And then, before anyone could answer, he'd explain, linking the ancient to the immediate, folding history into the present like batter into bread. Suddenly, his proposal didn't seem so risky. It had precedent, it had gravity, it had the weight of time behind it. Now let's consider the morale boost. Reading made Napoleon feel ready. But quoting what he read, that made others feel he was wise. Imagine hearing your general quote Seneca before a battle. It may not make you more accurate with a musket, but it might make you believe you're following someone who sees the whole picture, someone who isn't just reacting, but thinking. And that belief, that's power. Napoleon knew it. That's why he memorized entire paragraphs, why he kept books within arm's reach during council meetings, why he sometimes began speeches with Tacitus once said. He wasn't just sharing facts, he was creating a mythology of himself as a man informed by centuries. Of course, it wasn't always perfect. Once, during a particularly tense campaign, he misquoted Cicero in front of 2 staff members who'd studied Latin at university. There was an awkward pause. One of them gently corrected him. Napoleon, without missing a beat, replied, "Cicero was a great man, but I prefer to quote him in French." The conversation moved on. So did the campaign. And Cicero, presumably, rolled in his grave. But here's the deeper truth. Napoleon didn't just look to books to justify what he already wanted to do. Sometimes they changed his mind. There were nights when he paused at a passage, reread it, and reconsidered a plan, a phrase, a mistake, a cautionary tale. It could reshape his view, rein him in, make him hesitate, in a good way. Books in those moments became not just strategies, but checks, gentle warnings, whispers of, "This has happened before. Be careful." And isn't that the heart of it? The idea that stories, true, half-true, poetic, mythic, can steer us. That the lives of long-dead men can echo forward into our decisions. That the past is not a chain, but a compass. Napoleon believed that, and so, while others sharpened sabers and plotted flank maneuvers, he sharpened his mind with Plutarch, Tacitus, Polybius, and the occasional romance novel. Because strategy isn't just movement, it's meaning, and books gave him both. So tonight, as you rest, imagine this. A battlefield tent, a single candle, a general hunched over a borrowed history. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorts in its sleep. A drum falls silent, and the wind carries the sound of a page turning. In that quiet moment, a strategy is born. From story, romance novels and Roman tactics, where we discover that even the mightiest generals sometimes just want to read about doomed lovers. Napoleon Bonaparte. The man, the myth, the short-tempered strategist. He's conquered cities, crowned himself emperor, rewritten the laws of France, and tonight, he's curled under a military blanket, reading a love story. Let's set the scene. Outside, the wind rattles the tent poles, drums murmur in the distance. Some poor soldier is snoring audibly from 3 tents over. Inside, a flickering lamp, a folded map of Vienna, and resting gently on the general's knee, a copy of Paul et Virginie, a sweet, sentimental novel about 2 childhood friends growing up on a tropical island whose innocent love is torn apart by colonial society, ocean storms, and heartbreak. Not exactly what you'd expect to find next to a stack of military treatises, but there it is. And Napoleon is, how do we put this, very into it. You see, for all his martial brilliance and steel-willed resolve, Napoleon had a deep, soft undercurrent of romanticism. He loved tragic stories, he admired noble suffering, and he believed in the power of emotion to move people on the battlefield and beyond. He once wrote, "The heart must be trained as surely as the mind," which sounds suspiciously like something a man would say after crying over a particularly poetic chapter. Let's talk about Paul et Virginie for a moment. Written by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre in 1788, it was one of the most popular novels in pre-revolutionary France. A tale of paradise, innocence, social cruelty, and love that doesn't quite survive the storm literally. The book was soaked in moral virtue, nature worship, and gentle tragedy. And Napoleon adored it. He reportedly read it several times, carried a copy with him during the Egyptian campaign, and recommended it to friends, secretaries, and at least one field surgeon. When asked why he liked it so much, he once said, "Because it speaks to what is pure in man and cruel in the world," which is kind of poetic, actually. And that is where things get interesting, because Napoleon, the same man who reshaped Europe, absolutely loved the melodrama. Yes, he read Plutarch and Caesar and Tacitus. Yes, he annotated maps with military theories and reorganized troop movements in the margins of political pamphlets. But he also cried over novels. He felt things deeply. He once scolded one of his generals, not for poor planning, but for mocking a character in a book. "You may defeat an enemy," he said, "but that does not make you better than a good man who suffers." Somewhere, a violin began playing itself. He didn't stop with Paul et Virginie. He had a small collection of novels, romantic, tragic, sometimes even slightly scandalous, that he rotated through on long campaigns. Julie, or The New Eloise by Rousseau, more doomed love, this time with extra philosophy. Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, a very long, very sad, very English novel about virtue, pressure, and family dishonor. The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, perhaps the most emo book of the 18th century, featuring a love triangle, despair, and an ending that made Napoleon dramatically sigh in public. He loved Werther so much, in fact, that he carried it with him almost everywhere. It became part of his emotional toolkit, something to ground him when the world felt too sharp, too political, too noisy. Even emperors need to feel understood. Now, his staff had mixed feelings about this. Some found it charming, others mildly concerning. There's a famous and probably exaggerated anecdote of Napoleon riding into camp, holding a copy of Werther in one hand and barking orders with the other, pausing only to wipe away a tear. That's probably a stretch. But it is true that he often quoted romantic literature in casual conversation, especially with women. He once sent Josephine a letter where he lifted an entire paragraph from Julie, or The New Eloise, slightly altered to make it sound more Bonaparte. She probably noticed, but still, effort. So how does this connect with Roman tactics? Well, strangely enough, it does, because Napoleon's mind didn't divide things the way we often do. To him, reading a story about love and loss wasn't separate from strategy, it was part of it. Because love and loss, emotion and psychology, these were real forces in battle. A soldier fights differently when he believes he's protecting something sacred. A population resists differently when they feel their dignity is threatened. A general commands differently when he understands what truly moves people. Napoleon once said, "To control a man, understand his heart first, his mind second." So when he read romantic novels, he wasn't just indulging, he was studying the soul, training his emotional intelligence, learning about desire, fear, sacrifice, pride. He used these insights in diplomacy, in propaganda, in speechwriting, even in the way he shaped laws, because a law that doesn't feel fair will never be accepted, and a ruler who doesn't understand feeling won't rule for long. That might sound far-fetched, but think of how he treated the civil code, later called the Napoleonic Code. Yes, it was based on logic and Enlightenment ideals, but it also included language that was emotionally persuasive, phrases about honor, family, and duty. You don't get that from engineering manuals. You get it from novels. Of course, not all his emotional ideas landed perfectly. He once tried to gift a heavily annotated copy of Werther to a military governor who politely returned it, saying he preferred accounts ledgers. Not everyone was as literary. Still, the point remained. Napoleon saw no shame in feeling deeply. He saw it as part of command, part of being fully alive. And so, in the quiet hours, between battles, between speeches, between borders, he read. Sometimes it was Roman tactics, sometimes it was doomed love, sometimes both in the same evening. And who's to say they didn't go together? A siege is a kind of heartbreak. A surrender is a kind of confession. A battlefield, in its own awful way, is always telling a story. Napoleon just wanted to read it before writing his own ending. So tonight, as the pages settle and the lights dim, picture him there, a man of war curled around a gentle book, smiling maybe, or frowning, or silently mouthing a line he likes. Outside, the wind carries the smell of smoke. Inside, a heart learns something new. Because even the world's fiercest minds sometimes fall in love with fiction. The Librarian's Daily Duties, where we follow the unsung hero who had to keep philosophy dry and poetry alphabetized while the world burned down around him. Let's take a moment to pity a very specific kind of man, not a soldier, not a general, not a spy or a mapmaker or even a cook, but something far more mysterious, the battlefield librarian. He doesn't fire muskets, he doesn't ride a horse particularly well. He almost certainly has ink on at least 3 fingers at all times. And every morning before breakfast, he checks a list of books that are missing, damp, misshelved, or mysteriously borrowed by someone who swears they gave it back. This is the man responsible for Napoleon's library, and his job was not easy. Let's begin with his morning. He wakes up just before dawn. The camp is already stirring. Soldiers coughing, officers bickering, someone trying to boil water over a fire that just refuses to light. Our librarian blinks blearily and fumbles for his boots. Not because he wants to face the cold, but because the emperor might request a copy of Tacitus before sunrise. And if that copy isn't ready, let's just say, it will be a very long day. He checks the library cart first, a heavy wooden box mounted on a reinforced wagon axle, covered with canvas, reinforced with iron bands, and packed tighter than a miser's purse. Inside, history in multiple languages, strategy in even more, a full shelf of Greek classics, French novels, scandalous and otherwise, volumes of geography, military law, botany, and something ambiguously labeled miscellaneous observations. He opens the chest like a surgeon opening a patient. Everything must be dry, everything must be ordered, everything must be accessible, because at any moment Napoleon might summon a book, not vaguely, but specifically. I want the second volume of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Greek to Roman, where Brutus meets Cassius, the edition with the green spine, yes, that one. if the librarian hands him the wrong edition or, heaven forbid, a French translation instead of the original Latin? Well, let's just say Napoleon has a very expressive eyebrow. After inventory comes damage control, because books don't travel well in wagons, spines crack, pages warp, ink bleeds if it rains and the crates aren't sealed tightly enough. So the librarian lights a small fire near the edge of camp, not too smoky, so as not to attract enemy attention, and begins the sacred ritual of battlefield book repair. Damp books are pressed flat with smooth stones, torn pages are patched with linen and glue, loose covers are re-stitched with thread meant for uniforms. Imagine him sitting cross-legged, humming softly, mending a copy of Thucydides while a platoon of cavalry trots past, none of them noticing that the man crouched in the mud is saving a 2,000-year-old war story from mold. Then there's circulation. Ah, yes, Napoleon, for all his grandeur, was something of a repeat borrower. He would check out the same books over and over, scribbling thoughts in the margins, dog-earing pages, even occasionally, though this is unconfirmed, tearing out a page he particularly liked. The librarian's job was to track these movements. If the rights of man went missing for more than 2 days, he had to find it. If Polybius was found under the general of artillery's cot, he had to retrieve it, diplomatically. If a junior officer smuggled a novel into his saddlebag, the librarian would know. And he would sigh. He always sighed. And then there were the requests, at any hour from any tent. Sometimes they made sense. The Emperor would like Livy, Volume 1, Italian edition. Sometimes they were baffling. He wants a book about rivers, not military ones, just rivers. Sometimes they were oddly emotional. Do you have anything about fathers and sons, but not sad? Actually, a little sad is fine. The librarian would nod solemnly and consult his catalogue, which was written by hand on parchment, updated daily and more precious than any map. That catalogue was everything. Without it, the library was a pile of expensive, flammable rectangles. With it, it was power. And there were rules. Oh yes, Napoleon respected books too much to let them be handled carelessly. He didn't allow grease-stained fingers on volumes. He didn't tolerate wine being spilled on maps. And he absolutely did not permit soldiers to borrow books without logging the date, time, and purpose. Although this didn't stop anyone. The librarian, in turn, had to police the lending system like a sleepy hawk. He developed a look, the kind of withering, unamused glare usually reserved for stern aunts and overworked tailors. One glance could freeze a corporal mid-page. His evenings were no better. If Napoleon couldn't sleep, and often he couldn't, the librarian would be summoned. Sometimes gently. Sometimes via an out-of-breath aide bursting into the tent yelling, "He needs something Roman! Now!" He'd scramble through the cart, lanterns swinging wildly, muttering, "Roman! Roman! Where did I put Sallust?" Then run it, carefully but quickly, to the Emperor's tent, where Napoleon, still in uniform, would be pacing. Without looking, he'd take the book, flip it open, and begin reading aloud. It is always easy to begin a war, but very difficult to end it. The librarian would nod, retreat, and try just once to get some sleep before the next request. And yet, for all the absurdity, he loved it. Because he wasn't just hauling books. He was shaping ideas, preserving knowledge, feeding the mind of a man who ruled by thought as much as by sword. He wasn't just a librarian, he was a silent architect of empire. Of course, nobody wrote songs about him. There were no medals for heroic book preservation under fire. No portraits in military museums of the man gluing page 47 back into the Republic with one hand while holding off a goat with the other. But his work mattered. Because while Napoleon gave speeches, drew maps and charged across Europe, the librarian was behind the curtain, safeguarding the wisdom that made it all possible. So tonight, as you drift gently toward dreams, think of him, that unsung, ink-stained man. The one who could find Aristotle in a blizzard, who kept his catalogue dry in a thunderstorm, who delivered bedtime philosophy to a man who was rewriting the world. And maybe, just maybe, read a quiet poem of his own before turning in. Because even battlefield librarians need a chapter for themselves. Books that traveled more than you, where we follow a handful of well-read, well-worn, and wildly well-traveled books through storms, sieges, and suspicious customs officers. Most people think of books as stationary creatures. They sit quietly on shelves, collecting dust, minding their business, waiting to be read. They're homebodies, reliable, bookish, rarely in a hurry, but not Napoleon's books. Oh no, Napoleon's books went on adventures. They marched across Europe, they crossed mountains, they got soaked in rivers, lost in sieges, and repurposed as seat cushions during awkward diplomatic dinners. Some were taken into Egypt and nearly buried under sandstorms. Others survived the Russian campaign, frostbitten, battered, but technically still readable. These were not just books, these were veterans. Let's take one as an example, a humble-looking copy of the Commentaries of Julius Caesar. Bound in soft leather, margins crowded with notes in Napoleon's famously tiny, twitchy handwriting. This book began its journey in Paris in a cozy study with polished floors and proper lighting. Then it was loaded into a crate. That crate was loaded onto a cart. That cart was dragged over the Alps. At one point, the cart flipped over on a narrow mountain pass. The books were scattered across the snow like fallen leaves. Caesar, for his part, landed spine up near a goat, recovered, dusted off and dried by the fire. The book pressed on. Next stop, northern Italy, then Bavaria, then Vienna, where it sat on a bedside table next to a crumpled speech draft and a small bowl of olives. By the time it made it back to France, the book had travelled farther than most of Napoleon's staff and smelled faintly of saddle oil and victory. And that was just one book. Others followed similar and sometimes stranger paths. One well-loved volume of Tacitus is believed to have made the journey to Egypt in 1798. It was packed into Napoleon's field library, wrapped in oiled canvas and carefully stored inside a waterproof trunk labelled "Delicate Books and Biscuits." Unfortunately, the biscuits did not survive the Nile crossing. The books, mostly intact, though Tacitus ended up with a small bite mark on the corner, possibly camel-related. Then there was the Iliad. Napoleon's personal copy had been rebound 3 times, annotated in both French and Latin, and once accidentally left behind at a border outpost near Ulm. An aide-de-camp had to ride nearly 12 miles through rain and cannon fire to retrieve it. Upon return, the soldier presented the book like a sacred relic. Napoleon took it without a word, opened it, smiled slightly, then said, "You missed a page." It was a joke, probably. These books didn't just travel, they aged. They wore battle scars. One had candle wax dripped across its index. Another had a musket ball hole clean through chapter 6. Some had torn corners patched with linen scraps. One had a faint bloodstain from a paper cut sustained during a particularly heated debate over Roman naval tactics. The books were not pristine, they were experienced. They'd been read in tents and on ships, beside campfires and in candlelit inns. They'd been stuffed into saddlebags, flattened under bedrolls, and sometimes used as makeshift pillows. One copy of Plutarch's Lives was found with a crushed rose between the pages. No one quite knows why. They saw more of the world than many people ever would, from Corsican coasts to Egyptian deserts, from Viennese salons to Russian snowfields. Books that began life in Parisian print shops ended up gazing at the pyramids. Books written in Greek were read in tents outside Moscow. Books about the Roman Empire traveled through the ruins of the Holy Roman Empire, while Napoleon quietly drafted its replacement. There's something strangely beautiful about that, like time folding in on itself. Old words meeting new empires, but the journey didn't end with Napoleon. After his fall, the books scattered. Some were stolen, some were gifted to loyal officers. Some were sold quietly by cash-strapped couriers who figured nobody would miss a battered copy of The Prince. They turned up in strange places. One book, identified by Napoleon's marginalia, was found in a British officer's collection in Sussex. Another surfaced in a monastery in Corsica, used as a teaching tool for Latin grammar. A few ended up in museums, quietly encased behind glass, their pages frozen open mid-thought. A visitor might glance at them for a moment, not realizing that this tired old volume once rode into battle next to a man who shook the world. There's even a theory that one of his books made it to St. Helena with him, tucked inside the last trunk, smuggled past suspicious British guards, resting quietly beside a tin of preserved peaches. They say it was the sorrows of young Werther, because even in exile, Napoleon liked a good cry. In total, no one knows exactly how many of Napoleon's books made the full journey. Some estimates suggest his traveling libraries contained 100 to 300 books, depending on the campaign. Fewer survived, but those that did, they've become artifacts, not just of literature, but of lived literature. They aren't rare because they're old. They're rare because they were there. They lived through history while describing it. They survived sieges and snow and soup spills. They carried not just stories, but stories about stories. And isn't that the strangest, sweetest thing, that a man known for war, for his ambitions, his ego, his endless drive to redraw the map, cared enough to carry books, to protect them, to reread them, to make sure they came along for the ride? Because while borders changed and crowns fell, a book was something solid. Familiar, true, something to hold on to when the world was shifting underfoot. So tonight, as you settle into your blankets, think of those books. The ones that traveled farther than you. Worn, dog-eared, whispering old wisdom under newer skies. They saw the rise and fall of empires and made it home. Mostly, the book ban debates, where we wander into the quiet, candlelit hypocrisy of a man who censored the public, but secretly read what he banned. So far, we've met Napoleon the reader, Napoleon the romantic, Napoleon the strategist, with a backpack full of Greeks and Romans. But now let's meet another version of the man, Napoleon the censor. The same man who once said, books are the nourishment of the mind, also said, the press must be controlled with the same firmness as the army. So, that's awkward. You see, Napoleon loved books, his books, but other people's books, books with opinions that didn't match his, books that made fun of him, questioned him, or, heaven forbid, suggested that democracy might still be worth a second look. Those books made him uncomfortable, or, in Napoleon's own words, dangerous to public harmony, which is, of course, a very elegant way of saying, I don't like being criticized in pamphlet form. As first consul and later emperor, Napoleon controlled the press with meticulous precision. He reduced the number of newspapers in Paris from over 70 to just 4. The remaining papers were monitored, edited, and gently threatened on a regular basis. Publishers were instructed to submit manuscripts for approval. Bookstores were expected to track who bought which books, and any text that even hinted at anti-authoritarian ideas was likely to be banned, burned, or quietly discontinued for your safety. And yet, behind all this firm control, behind the curtain of censorship, Napoleon kept reading those very same books. Secretly, curiously, greedily. You see, Napoleon didn't just ban books because he thought they were wrong. He often banned them because he knew they were powerful. He understood that ideas could spread like wildfire, that the wrong pamphlet at the right moment could inspire rebellion, that a single sentence artfully written could do more damage than a cavalry charge, and so he banned them. But he also wanted to know what they said, because how can you fight an idea if you haven't studied it first? He treated censored books like enemy generals, best kept under close watch. Some of his favorites to ban and read in secret included Voltaire, especially the spicy essays that mocked religion and monarchy. Montesquieu for suggesting that maybe power shouldn't all be in one person's hands. Rousseau particularly The Social Contract, which says people should govern themselves. Napoleon loved this one, but only he could understand it properly, of course. And various British and American pamphlets about liberty, human rights, and the odd suggestion that maybe emperors weren't always necessary. Dangerous stuff. The kind of reading that made one think, and that of course was the problem. He once told an advisor, "We cannot allow the people to read that which would make them less governable." But later that night, the very same advisor caught him reading that exact material. Napoleon didn't even flinch. He looked up from the book, smiled faintly, and said, "I must understand the disease if I'm to cure it." It was hard to argue with that, especially when he said it while underlining something in Thomas Paine. His double standard extended beyond censorship. He regularly summoned authors and philosophers to court, only to scold them for being too clever. He once told a historian, "Your book is brilliant, but it gives the people ideas, and we can't have that now, can we?" The historian nodded and quietly changed nothing. Another time, a playwright submitted a comedy for review that lightly poked fun at authoritarianism. Napoleon read it, laughed, then banned it. When questioned, he replied, "Yes, it amused me." But the people must not know what amuses me, a very emperor-like thing to say. But even as he censored, he couldn't help but be drawn to subversive ideas. He respected them in a strange way. He called Rousseau the most dangerous thinker in Europe, and then kept The Social Contract on his nightstand. He claimed Voltaire was too clever for the good of France, and then quoted him in letters to Josephine. It's the classic paradox, censor by day, read in secret by candlelight. It makes you wonder how many banned authors would have been delighted or horrified to know that the Emperor of the French was quietly devouring their forbidden words with a glass of wine and a smirk. And here's the part nobody talks about. Napoleon loved the drama of it all, the secret reading, the tension, the idea that he was consuming something forbidden. It made him feel alive, engaged, slightly dangerous. A man surrounded by sycophants, yes, but still alone in the company of rebellious minds. There's something almost boyish in the way he treated books he'd banned, like a student hiding a comic inside a math textbook, except instead of comics, it was Voltaire. And instead of math class, it was an empire. But of course, censorship has a way of backfiring. People always want what they can't have. And the more Napoleon banned certain texts, the more people whispered about them, passed them hand to hand, memorized key phrases, smuggled them across borders inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Ideas, as it turns out, don't like being locked in trunks, and books, they have a funny habit of surviving. So tonight, as you rest in the gentle dark, picture the Emperor of France, reading contraband by candlelight, sitting alone in a tent, flipping through a banned philosophy treatise, muttering to himself that it's dangerous nonsense, then highlighting his favorite part anyway. Because even those who rule the world can't quite resist a good book, especially the kind they tell others not to read. When books froze solid, where we follow Napoleon's library into the Russian winter and learn that ink has its limits. There are many things books are good at surviving. They endure boredom, outlive their authors, even sit politely through centuries of neglect on dusty shelves. But there is one enemy books do not handle well: cold, bitter, biting, bone-snapping cold. And in the winter of 1812, Napoleon's travelling library faced its most brutal campaign yet. Not against enemy soldiers, not against critics or censors or careless coffee drinkers, but against the coldest, harshest, most literary unfriendly environment imaginable: Russia in winter. Let's set the scene. It's late November. Napoleon's Grande Armée is retreating from Moscow. What was once a force of over 600,000 men is now a ragged, frostbitten ghost of itself, shivering, starving, marching in silence. The air itself feels brittle. Snow falls sideways, carts break, horses fall, water freezes solid inside canteens, and somewhere in this frozen apocalypse, a wagon creaks slowly through the snow. It's slower than the rest, heavier than most, and filled not with supplies but with books. Books that are now completely, unapologetically frozen. We often think of freezing as something that happens to people, or rivers, or soup. But books, oh yes, in Russia, books can freeze. The glue in the spines stiffens into glass. Ink smears and hardens. Pages stick together like they've made some private decision never to be read again. A copy of Cicero becomes a brick. A volume of Tacitus turns into a rectangular ice sculpture of regret. The library, once the pride of the campaign, has become a rolling literary glacier. There's a story, half myth, half memoir, of an officer finding a copy of the Iliad one morning, frozen solid. He brings it to the campfire, tries to thaw it slowly, but the heat cracks the leather, warps the pages, and sends little flakes of parchment curling off like ash. It is, by all accounts, heartbreaking. The book dies a quiet, crackling death. Somewhere, Homer shivers. Meanwhile, Napoleon himself is in a foul mood. He's cold, he's exhausted, and worst of all, his favourite copy of Plutarch's Lives has frozen shut. Aides try everything. They rub it with gloves, wrap it in furs, tuck it under their coats like a newborn child. Nothing works. The margins are unreadable. The cover is stiff. The book emits a sort of papery groan when opened. Eventually, Napoleon abandons it with a sigh and a muttered, "Even wisdom must wait for spring." And so, the once proud library wagon becomes more of a ceremonial relic. It trundles behind the army like a loyal but increasingly ridiculous pet. Soldiers pass it with blank stares. A few joke that they'd rather burn Rousseau than freeze. One actually tries. The book won't catch fire, too damp. Irony, as always, survives. To be clear, Napoleon could have left the books behind. They were heavy. They were useless in this weather. They were, at this point, just expensive cubes of misery, but he didn't. Even as food ran out and ammunition was abandoned, he ordered the library cart to keep moving. Why? Because he couldn't bear to lose them. Books to Napoleon were more than tools. They were symbols of order, of thought, of identity. If the books made it, some part of him would too. There's something deeply human about that. When everything else fell apart, his army, his plans, his health, he clung to the idea that somewhere in the cart was Cicero, not giving orders, not winning battles, just being there, waiting to be read again. But not every book survived. Some were left behind in the snow, little leather lumps half buried beneath drifts. A copy of Virgil was reportedly found weeks later by a foraging patrol, partially eaten by wolves. No one knows why. Another book, The Rights of Man, was used as emergency insulation inside a pair of boots. The irony was noted, then ignored. A few lucky volumes made it to Vilnius, thawed, rebound, shelved in libraries where their pages are still slightly wrinkled from their winter ordeal. Museum labels read, "Travelled with Napoleon, Winter Campaign, 1812." But you can still see the wear, the watermarks, the brittle edges, proof that even words can get frostbite. And what about Napoleon? He never quite got over it. Later in life, he would mention the Russian winter with a sort of weary reverence. But when he spoke about his losses, it wasn't just soldiers and cannons he mourned, it was ideas. "The snow took everything," he once said, then paused. "Even my books." At St. Helena, during his final exile, he made sure his new library was housed indoors. He reread many of the works that froze in 1812. Sometimes slowly, sometimes aloud, as if trying to bring them back to life, as if warming their spirits after a very long sleep. So tonight, as the wind outside rattles your window softly, spare a thought for those brave, unread pages, for the copies of Plutarch and Tacitus and Homer that braved snowstorms, frostbite, and existential dampness, all in the service of one stubborn reader. Because even in the coldest corners of history, a book still hopes to be opened. A library's final march, where the books that followed empires across continents take their last quiet steps and begin to disappear. By now you know the books. They've marched across mountains, sailed to Egypt, frozen solid in Russia, and survived at least 3 accidental candle spills, 1 mule-related incident, and a fair amount of overly dramatic sighing from their most devoted reader. But every story has its ending, and for Napoleon's travelling library, that ending came not with fire, but with footsteps, retreating footsteps, and silence. It's 1815. Napoleon has returned from exile on Elba, briefly, triumphantly, the famous 100 days. He gathers supporters, rallies old allies. The drums roll again, the banners rise, and somewhere in the background, yes, once again, his books are being packed, carefully, lovingly, wrapped in cloth, loaded into crates. The librarian, now older, perhaps a bit more cynical, still inspects every volume. They've made it this far, surely they'll make it just a little farther. Just one more campaign, just one more march. But this time, the ending comes quickly, at a place called Waterloo. You've heard of it, of course. The final battle, the last stand, the moment where empires turned, and history, like a tired reader, finally closed the chapter. Napoleon is defeated. The army scatters, the wagons are seized, and the little travelling library, the quiet, faithful companion of so many years, begins its final march. Only this time it's not going home. Let's follow it. Picture the aftermath of Waterloo. Mud, rain, confusion, abandoned boots, torn flags. Among the wreckage, a tipped-over cart, not full of weapons, not full of gold, books, just books, some fallen into the mud, some still neatly packed, all of them waiting like old dogs for someone to come back and claim them. No one does. Some are taken. British officers wandering the battlefield spot the library and do what humans have always done when faced with unattended literature. They start poking through it. "This looks valuable," one says, flipping through a soggy Livy. "I'll take this one home." Another pockets a copy of The Art of War. How poetic. A third lifts a volume of Rousseau, chuckling as he reads the inscription on the inside cover, "Property of the Emperor." And just like that, the library begins to vanish, not burned, not buried, but scattered, piece by piece, page by page, across Europe. Some books are claimed by collectors. They end up in drawing rooms, shelved between hunting memoirs and porcelain figurines. Guests are told, with great pride, this belonged to Napoleon. Some are sold, auctioned in Paris, smuggled into England, gifted to dukes and diplomats. A few even end up in museums eventually, behind glass, under lights. No longer companions on muddy marches, but relics. untouched, unread, preserved like butterflies, pinned and silent. Others simply disappear. Lost in attics, misplaced in estate sales, used to prop up wobbly furniture in country homes that didn't know or didn't care who once turned their pages. Maybe one became a diary, maybe one was thrown out during spring cleaning, maybe one is still there in a quiet corner of someone's bookshelf waiting to be rediscovered. We'll never know, because, like Napoleon's empire, his library didn't end with a crash, it ended with dispersion. And what of Napoleon? After Waterloo, he was exiled again, this time to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic. No return this time, no armies, no fanfare. But he did bring books, not all, of course. The great travelling library was gone, but a new collection was assembled for him in exile. History, mostly, philosophy, a few novels, fewer war manuals, more poetry. He reread The Sorrows of Young Werther. He studied the Iliad again. He dictated memoirs, quoted Plutarch, and argued about Caesar's legacy with anyone who would listen. He read more than he slept. Perhaps in the quiet of that final island, surrounded by the sound of waves and the wind, he finally had time to finish the chapters he'd once skimmed in a tent before a battle. He never stopped being a reader. And in that way, the library never really ended, because it had done its work. It had shaped a mind, supported a dream, accompanied a man through snow, sand, and sorrow. And though the books were scattered, though the shelves were emptied and the crates unpacked, they left fingerprints on ideas, on decisions, on the very way Napoleon saw the world. He may have fallen, but his library didn't. It dispersed and took root in collectors, in scholars, in museums, in stories like this one. Tonight, if you feel something ending, or changing, or simply fading gently away, think of the library. The one that marched across Europe in silence, that stood by a man as he built and lost the world, that didn't demand glory, only light, only time, only space to be read. Let the endings come, let the page turn, because even when the story finishes, the words remain. And somewhere, maybe even in your own bookshelf, a page that once rode in the shadow of an empire is still waiting for someone like you to read it again. 14. Collectors, Thieves and Bookworms, where we follow the strange afterlives of Napoleon's scattered books and meet the people who couldn't resist keeping a piece of his story. The empire had fallen, the horses were gone, the tents packed up, the cannons silenced, and the little travelling library, once so proudly hauled from battlefield to battlefield, was now a memory. But books have a way of slipping through cracks in history. They do not vanish, they resurface, sometimes after decades, sometimes after centuries, always with a whisper, never a bang. This is the story of what happened after the library scattered, when the books left the emperor's shadow and wandered out into the world. It began quietly. A British officer returns home from Waterloo. In his pack, a weathered copy of Plutarch. Its spine is cracked. Its pages smell faintly of leather, mud, and campfire smoke. He doesn't think much of it at first. But at a dinner party, someone notices the small embossed NB on the inside cover. Napoleon Bonaparte. Gasps. Suddenly the book is not just a book, it's a trophy. The officer puts it on display behind glass, flanked by medals, under a portrait of himself looking slightly more heroic than necessary. Guests marvel at it. Children are told not to touch it. Eventually it is passed down generation to generation, each inheritor telling the same story. This book belonged to Napoleon. The Napoleon. They don't read it, of course, but they dust it regularly. Elsewhere, a Parisian bookseller stumbles across a crate of forgotten volumes in a wine cellar. Mostly old theology and maps, but tucked near the bottom, a copy of The Civil Wars by Appian, with pages annotated in an unusually tight, spiky hand. He squints. Napoleon? Could it be? He checks against a known letter. Same slant, same abbreviations, same habit of underlining things 3 times for dramatic effect. He sells it, eventually, quietly, for far more than a wine crate is worth. The buyer? A duke? Or maybe a banker? The record is fuzzy, but the book lives on, now shelved beside rare coins and ancient fossils, still marked with the thoughts of a man who once ruled everything. Not every book had such polite retirements. Some were stolen more than once. A volume of Cicero passed through 6 hands in 1 year. Stolen from a general, reclaimed by a librarian, borrowed indefinitely by a count, and finally sold by a suspiciously well-read stable boy to a traveling antiquarian. To this day, it rests in a private library in Switzerland, next to a framed note that reads simply, "From the Emperor's Camp, 1812. No one asks how it got there, they just admire it. Other books were read, truly read. A schoolteacher in Lyon once inherited a tattered volume of The Social Contract, unaware of its origin. She taught from it, underlined it, passed it to students. Only later did a curious librarian notice the binding. Napoleon's crest, faint but visible. She gasped, then smiled. "And I suppose the Emperor has helped with my lesson plans," she said. The book was donated to a museum, but she made them promise one thing, that it would stay open, not sealed behind glass. "Books are meant to breathe," she said, "even imperial ones." In another case, a volume of military theory turned up in a London bookshop in the 1870s. It had no label, but the dealer noticed a folded letter tucked inside, addressed to "My brave Marshal" in Napoleon's hand. They called it a forgery. Then they saw the watermark, the ink, the tear in the lower right corner that matched a known page from the Emperor's own hand. It sold the next day. Not to a military museum, not to a university, to a man who simply loved books. He kept it by his bedside, reading it slowly every night. He said it helped him sleep. Some books became legends. One copy of the Iliad, said to have been read aloud by Napoleon before the Battle of Austerlitz, was rumored to have survived 3 fires and 1 duel over its ownership. It vanished in the 1890s. Then, in 1967, it reappeared at a Paris estate sale, wedged between gardening manuals and a cookbook called The Art of Elegant Stewing. The buyer paid 5 francs, didn't realize what he had, until someone noticed the penciled note on the flyleaf, "Read before battle, calm before storm." NB, that book now sits in a quiet corner of a private collection. Still read, still loved, still bearing the faint scent of tobacco and old ink. And so it went. A library that once moved like a shadow beside the greatest general of the age now lived 1,000 smaller lives. Scattered, yes, but not lost. Some were honored, some were forgotten, some were read by candlelight in quiet homes where no one knew who had held them first. But all of them, every last one, carried traces of their past. A smudge of wax, a folded corner, a hasty margin note about Caesar's flanking tactics, little echoes, little ghosts. And what of the bookworms, the true ones? They didn't care that the book was Napoleon's. They cared that it was beautiful, that it spoke, that it had survived. One scholar, having tracked down a long-lost volume of Montesquieu with Napoleon's notes in the margins, said this: "I don't keep it because he read it. I keep it because it was read over and over. It is alive. That is enough." A perfect sentiment. From one bookworm to another. So tonight, as you rest and the world falls quiet, remember this. Books outlive kings, outlast wars, outwalk armies. And somewhere out there, maybe in a library, maybe on a shelf, maybe in the hands of a curious stranger, A book that once sat beside Napoleon's candlelight is still whispering its story. To someone new, why it still matters. Where we sit with what it all meant, books, battles, legacy, and why a travelling library still whispers to us across the silence of centuries. South, we've travelled a long road together, across snow and sand, through candlelit tents and battlefield mud, over the Alps and through the fog of memory. We've walked beside mules carrying philosophy. We've stood in the cold while pages froze into silence. We've followed dog-eared books into exile, into basements, into museums, and into the lives of people who didn't even know, whose hands once turned the same pages. And now, at the end of the journey, we're left with a question. Why does this story matter? Why should we care that Napoleon Bonaparte, warlord and emperor, brought a library with him to battle? The answer, quietly, is this: because it's human. Deeply, strangely, beautifully human. Because here was a man with absolute power, commanding armies, drawing borders, deciding the fate of nations, and in the few hours when he wasn't doing any of that, he read not just manuals, not just strategies, but stories, philosophy, poetry, sad little novels with sentimental endings. He read because he had to, because inside the armor and ambition he was still a mind that needed food, a heart that needed rhythm, a soul that needed company. Books were that company, and they still are. It matters because it reminds us that even the strongest among us reach for something stiller, something older, something wiser. And for Napoleon, that was books. He may have had 1,000 courtiers, but he still wanted to hear what Plutarch had to say. He may have reshaped half the world, but he still turned to the ancients for advice. It was never just about information, it was about orientation. Books were his compass, not to tell him what to do, but to remind him how to be. It matters because it shows that the great and the ordinary share the same need to read, to reflect, to understand. Whether you're a tired librarian in a smoky tent or a powerful emperor preparing for war, you still pause sometimes to turn a page, to underline a sentence, to nod at a line that feels like it was written just for you. That's the miracle of books. They cross time like bridges. They invite anyone from any era into a quiet conversation. Napoleon knew that, and that's why he brought them with him. Not for show, not for status, but because he couldn't face the world without them. It matters because it's strange and lovely, because it's one thing to know a man led armies. It's another to know he did so with a volume of Werther under his arm, that he quoted Seneca before battle, that he once argued with Voltaire in the margins while a storm rattled his tent. These details soften him, not to excuse, but to reveal. To remind us that every figure in history, every statue, every shadow on the page was once just a person reaching for something to read before bed. It matters because of what the books became. After the battles ended, after the banners fell, when the dust cleared and the empire was no more, the books remained, and they travelled, and they were touched, and they were read by hands that had never held a sword. They turned into heirlooms and artifacts and bedtime reading. They entered homes and schools and stories. They made people curious, not just about Napoleon, but about reading itself. They made books feel important again, not because a great man owned them, but because even a great man needed them. And perhaps it matters most because it's quiet. This is not a story of glory or conquest, not really. It's a story of a man and his books, of evenings in canvas tents, of candle wax on worn pages, of a small cart rolling behind a grand army, carrying nothing but questions and comfort, of the deep, private, fragile parts of a life that history rarely bothers to mention, the parts that happen between the cannons and the cheers. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the story draws to a close, let this thought carry you gently into sleep. In every great journey, no matter how loud or vast, there are still quiet moments. Moments of reading, moments of reflection, moments when even emperors just want a book to hold. And that's why it matters. Because in the end, we remember Napoleon not only as the man who changed Europe, but also as the man who, on a cold night far from home, turned to Plutarch for warmth. And maybe so can we. Sleep well, dear listener. And may your story, like all the best ones, be filled with good books and quiet moments between the noise.